This video was intended to be much longer, almost 10 hours long in fact. Due to unforeseen complications though, I'm instead going to upload it in a series of smaller parts. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you start there before continuing. Link in the description. Nothing I say better summarizes Archer's character than his first 30 seconds on screen. At first glance, the Archer of Fate Zero seems to be a relatively simplistic character. An expected response, considering that his role is mostly to act as an antagonist towards our heroes, with exception to his role in Kirei's character. There's no arc of his own to be discerned, no grand journey for him to go on, or a story to be told from his decisions and actions. But it would be a mistake to assume that everything on the surface is exactly the same on closer inspection. We don't get a complete introduction to his character until around episode 5, and so much of that character screams egotism and eccentricism. He's so full of himself, in fact, that he believes death is a worthy punishment for those who look at him without his consent. This is the most obvious trait that we can see from his introduction, but what else can we see from his first few moments on screen? What are his motivations? That's arguably the most unique thing about him, in contrast with the other servants. He's not here because he has any wish he wants to be granted, and as of the early episodes, the Grail doesn't even interest him yet. His first official battle with Assassin was one he had no real interest in. Even in the second battle, he shows no interest in joining until after Ryder enters, and it's only because Ryder called him a coward. He was perfectly content with watching Saber, Lancer, and Ryder battle it out in front of him instead of wiping them all out himself. He knows that his duty is to defeat the other servants in order to win the Grail, but he just doesn't care about any of it. When he engages with Berserker, it's not because it's advantageous, but because he feels offended. The Grail means nothing to him. There's nothing he wants from it because there's nothing that he could possibly want and didn't have that he couldn't obtain himself. As the King of Babylonia, he claims that all treasures in the world once belonged to him in some form or another. The Grail is no different. He doesn't need to claim it because it already belongs to him, or so he says. He even considers giving it up as a reward, as though it were indistinguishable from currency. He's arguably the only servant, and perhaps the only character at all, that would willingly give the Grail to anyone but his own master. So, if the Grail isn't his motivation, what is? Since he acted primarily as a spectator to Saber and Lancer's duel, it's likely this has been his main concern since then. Even in the fight at the river, he has no interest in even watching the battle with Castor, let alone fighting himself. Finding something, or rather someone, that can entertain him is all that concerns him. When he comes across Ryder out of the blue for no reason, who then offers him an invitation to a meeting with Saber, his first reaction isn't to kill him on the spot. Instead, he takes Ryder up on his offer because he thinks a banquet of kings sounds amusing. The banquet is where many of his motivations become more contextualized and comprehensive, but it's also where he gains a new motive for the remainder of the anime. He's shown to have a great interest in both Ryder and Saber. Ryder's goal is to conquer the world and his resolve to be able to do so, and Saber's selflessness to her people and country that have long since passed on, are both attributes that he takes interest in, especially the latter. The next episode dives a little deeper into what it is about those two that he finds amusing, and what he finds amusing about people in general.
傲岸にも2種類あってな。器が小さすぎる場合と望みが大きすぎる場合。
The latter definition of arrogance is one that fits Ryder perfectly. He wants to conquer the entire world and everything and everyone in it, even when someone like Archer stands in his way. From Archer's perspective, that goal is foolish, considering Ryder also failed to achieve the same goal in life. Likewise, Saber's failure to achieve her own dream in life, acting as a saint for the sake of her people, only for that same country to be consumed in spite of her efforts, is a thought that Archer takes great pleasure in. But what's equally telling about these two definitions of arrogance he lists is that neither of them fit himself. Claiming titles of both King of Babylonia and the first heroic spirit, it makes sense why his character would be so prideful as he is now. He has an ideal understanding of who he is and what he can do. He's neither unfit for the task of the Grail War, nor is his goal of stopping others from obtaining it so impossible. The ending of the anime is proof enough of that. For as superior as he claims to be, he's in no way arrogant, at least not by his definition. He's every bit as powerful and prestigious as he claims to be. He has no interest in the Grail or the war to claim it. All of it's beneath him, and it's only after he takes interest in Saber and Ryder that he even decides it's worth his attention.
あれが抱いていた身に余る夢は、その散り際の慟哭の涙。舐めればさぞ甘かったであろうな。
Excuse me, what the actual
Archer is motivated purely by the misery that he sees around him. He takes pleasure in watching struggles of others who can't stand the tasks they set out to achieve. Most of all, he enjoys spectating the challenges and trials of those who seek to reach what was never meant for them. This is also why he takes so little interest in his master. Tokiyomi is a man who plays according to plan. He's archetypal and, in many ways, predictable. Even Kuritsugu was able to determine within the first few episodes of Season 1 that he was working with Kirei and the Overseer. Any attempt to go outside the bounds of his own preparations are ones that Tokiyomi would rather rectify. And it's only when the unpredictable dictates the outcome or when he's most frustrated. He doesn't make alternate strategies if the outcome doesn't go the way he wants, because he expects them to do just that. Predictable, archetypal, one-note, and boring are the descriptors of Tokiyomi's character, and also how Archer describes him. In fact, there are many parallels that could be drawn between Archer's perspective and that of an audience member. This is most apparent by his behavior. He never attacks except when provoked or otherwise forced to. Up until then, he's content with watching the other servants battle each other for his own amusement. Much like how I was drawn to this anime by the idea of many different historical and mythical characters fighting each other over a battle royale in present day, Archer could also be described as someone with a similar taste in entertainment. The only difference is that, while the audience members watch this knowing the story is fiction, Archer takes interest in it despite how real their suffering is. But there's more to him than just that. It should be reminded that Fate Zero is a tragedy. The highlights of its writing are its tragic moments and what a viewer is going to get most captivated by. Similarly, Archer's entire modus operandi is observing the tragedies and suffering of the different characters around him. This is also why he's so interested in Kirei, due to how much their personal interests align. Although Kirei and Archer still differ in some ways, despite their shared sadism. In fact, the difference is arguably what separates him from any other prideful and arrogantly written character. For almost everything and everyone that he mocks and claims to be superior to, there are still elements of the things around him that he finds value to. Archer is not merely vain and boastful in the same way that someone like Joffrey Baratheon is. He finds things and even people in this world that he decides is worth his respect, in some capacity.
つくづく愉快なやつよ。道家でもないやつの知れ事でここまで笑ったのは久方ぶりだ。
Even as he calls Ryder a mongrel, he still finds something worth respecting about him and his ambitions. He understands that no one can truly live up to the standard that he can, but that they can't be like him doesn't mean that they're without value. If that were true, he wouldn't find any value in anything in this world, and it would hardly be worth ruling either. Saber, Ryder, Waver, in some way or another, had all earned respect from the King of Heroes, whether because of their determination of their unflinching loyalty, or their perseverance in the pursuit of goals he thinks is foolish for anyone but himself. Kirei would also fall into this category. The two share similar interests, so it only follows that they'd find a sense of companionship from one another. Unlike Kirei, however, Archer has interests in people beyond the kind of suffering that Kirei is after. Even for the struggles of Ryder and Saber, theirs are ones that deserve some semblance of acclaim, compared to the likes of Kari and Mato, which can only be described as misery all the way through. Ironically, part of the reason why I think that they're not very good. Sadism isn't the extent of what motivates him. Arrogance is a large part of his character, but it's not his whole defining character trait. For someone who, on the surface, appears to be every bit as one-note as someone like Tokiyomi is, just in a different flavor, he has far more going on than just He knows he's superior to everyone else, yet he has a standard that designates who he believes is worth his respect. He's gratified by the suffering of others, but also finds admirable traits in those who suffer as they persevere. And how fitting is it that so much about Ryunosuke's philosophy matches who Gilgamesh is as a character? Through Ryunosuke, the anime paints God in the picture of just another viewer. And by association, that Archer shares similar traits to that of the average viewer, it only shows that there are far more levels to Fate Zero's display of his superiority complex than what meets the eye. And it all points to why I believe that Fate Zero's Archer is an ideal villain for any story. And here's why. The anime displays him as haughty, but not arrogant. It presents him as the most powerful and most prestigious character and antagonist to be overcome. He's motivated primarily by his amusement in others' suffering, but can find respect in those he's entertained by. He has no arc to speak of, but doesn't need one as an antagonist. But that simplicity is also what makes him great as a villain. He's just as devious and charismatic as a Disney villain, but is given a much more dynamic character than one, which also allows him to play off the other characters and act as a support to their stories. And most of all, he's a perfect thematic foil to all the other protagonists who are drowning in the tragedy around them, while he and Kirei simply enjoy the show for themselves. Archer is a good antagonist, but not because he does anything special. He's basic for sure, don't get me wrong, only doing the minimum required of a villain, but doing it really well nonetheless. So while there's certainly more that we could want a villain to be, what else could a villain possibly need to be? By the end of the war, Gilgamesh achieved incarnation. It would be another 10 years until it would start again. How much exactly changed in that time? Well, if only there was so much to say about him. At first glance, it seems that Gilgamesh's motivations haven't changed that all, as he appears content to merely watch the world around him for the next 10 years without interference. Because of his initial inactivity in the war, we don't learn much about who he is until well into the second season. Our first impression of him is when he passes by both Sakura and Rin on their way homes, and he takes interest in the former. Because Bladeworks doesn't focus on Sakura, we're not sure why, but it could be assumed that he took interest in her suffering that she endured as she grew up in the Mato family. Beyond this, there's not much else we can learn about him. His second appearance is slightly longer than the first. He shows up to question Kirei's resolve after the war had officially begun. This is a little confusing because he should already know that Kirei doesn't care about the well-being of others and actively seeks out their suffering for his own amusement. And once again, there's not much else we learn that we don't already know. Though this is to be expected, being someone who acts as a spectator, it makes sense that he'd be mostly inactive. It isn't until episode 10 that he pairs with Shinji as his new master. I'm honestly a little confused what it even means to incarnate if he still needs a master and a mana source for him to survive. It's already very misleading that they describe his existence that way, because nothing has really changed about his predicament. Like, what exactly does it mean to incarnate if he still needs others to refuel his mana instead of replenishing it normally like any non-servant can? It's not exactly that similar to being alive if he still has a lot of the same downsides to being a servant, except now he can't use his spirit form. It's just a very strange wording, but not like there hasn't been a lot of misleading information in Bladeworks already. Speaking of which, the entire situation between the two already gives a lot of mixed signals. It's apparent that Gilgamesh isn't actually Shinji's master. What's confusing is that they play it off like he is, to imply that Gilgamesh needs him for anything. In fact, this wasn't even unplanned. It's implied that Kirei had intended to do the same thing with Castor's first master before he was killed. This is silly enough as an implication because this plan hinges on whoever they pick being as uneducated as Shinji. Anyone nominally trained in the Grail War would be able to tell that they aren't actually Gilgamesh's new master. But again, it wouldn't be for anything either. At best, he's a backup vessel for the Grail in case Rin doesn't work out. But I'm supposed to believe it's in character for someone as pompous and self-important as Gilgamesh to play servile to Shinji? I mean, maybe if he gained anything from it, but like I said, if they end up going with Rin anyway, all of this would be pointless. And for what? Am I expected to believe that there's some entertainment to be found in Shinji? So much entertainment, which isn't even shown on screen by the way, that Gilgamesh thinks it's worth abjecting himself for that reason alone?
Bullshit.
And I won't underplay how important it is to secure a plan B. With the number of close calls Rin has, it just makes sense. The problem is that Gilgamesh clearly doesn't care about having a plan B, and this becomes evident later. After forming a pact with Shinji, he hints at his endgame. He's disgusted by the surplus of humans on the planet and wants to purge them, after which he will claim rule over what remains. He says this after it's already been a week since the anime started, and at least another week since the war started, and he hasn't done anything until now. Then, after pairing with Shinji, who, need I remind you, is every bit as superfluous as the very same humans that Gilgamesh wants to purge, they wait around for another 3 days, for no reason made clear to us, before going after Ilya to steal her heart. He sounds very invested in this plan. This is supposed to be Gilgamesh, right? Like Epic of Gilgamesh? You're sure? It's been 13 days, and that's just since the anime started. If I even believe it's in character for him to sit around doing nothing for that time, let alone the 10 years before that, why now of all times does he finally decide to take initiative? Well, the answer is simple, because we didn't yet have a reason for Shiro and Rin to be at the castle at the same time as the battle with Berserker, and we couldn't have her get killed off screen, otherwise we couldn't milk the viewer's engagement with emotional then we couldn't establish the final villain for this route. During said fight, Shinji is put in danger on multiple occasions, first when the maids of the castle attack him, then when he gets dangerously close to Berserker, who could have killed him unintentionally. Even simply being within eyeshot of Ilya puts him at risk. There is still the ever-lingering question, why Gilgamesh even brought him here to begin with? If he just needs to keep track of their plan B, why can't Kirei do that? Why wouldn't Kirei do that? Why wouldn't Gilgamesh prefer he do that? If the goal was to secure the first eliminated master as a backup, why not incapacitate and lock them up someplace safe instead? Why even bother securing a plan B if they clearly don't care if he dies? What if that happened and Rin also died? Who would they have used as a vessel then? It's this irresponsible outlook on what should be a crucial part of Gilgamesh's motives that demonstrates just as much apathy towards these plans of his, and this trend continues going forward. Gilgamesh kills Ilya and Berserker before planning on doing the same to Shiro after giving away his position. Rin enters the room and gives her ultimatum, if you could call it that. If Gilgamesh doesn't leave, she'll kill Shinji. 2 episodes ago, the Ainsburn maids gave a similar threat, and Gilgamesh responded in kind. He is now given the same threat again, this time making the opposite decision. This is despite how much easier it would be to deal with Rin, and how much more he would benefit from doing so. He and Kirei both wanted her to be the vessel for the Grail. What makes this even more contrived is that he never needed to bring Shinji to the castle. This means that the only narrative reason Shinji is here at all is to excuse how our heroes survive. It isn't even that good of an excuse. Gilgamesh is more than capable of incapacitating Rin if he wants to. If she had killed Shinji, he'd have to subdue her anyways so long as he didn't have the vessel he wanted. Otherwise, he risks too much time passing before the heart expires, which, despite stating as much, doesn't actually seem to matter to him that much given what he does next. He only pretends to care so he has an excuse to convince Shinji to leave Rin alone. Are we really sure this is Gilgamesh? The same guy who forced himself onto every woman in Uruk before they could do it with their husbands. But he still intends to use Rin as the vessel for the Grail. We'd know as much, because, besides pointing it out, if he was satisfied with Shinji, he'd put the heart inside him right now rather than risk it expiring before he can use it. But if he's just too lazy to subdue her now, then what exactly is his plan to secure his vessel later? He and Shinji leave to do something unrelated before returning to the castle for no reason 20 to 30 hours later, only to find by complete luck that someone else had captured her for them.
That's a fake laugh. Fake.
That is the most real, authentic, hysterical laugh of my entire life, because that is not a plan.
It's barely a concept.
エミやシロを始末した後ならくれてやる。それが聞けないのなら、サーバントともども消えてもらう。
Now, yet another character gives them an ultimatum. Archer will hand over Rin, but only once his business with Shiro is concluded. If they break this pact, Archer says he'll kill them both. Gilgamesh has just been given another threat and another ultimatum. He takes no amount of offense to this, nor the fact that Shinji is just fine letting this deal play out when they should just take Rin themselves. We have no reason to think that Gilgamesh is in any way scared of Archer, and yet the series wants to pick and choose when his apathy is a relevant character trait, flipping it on and off whenever the scene suits it. We see that Gilgamesh makes decisions that not only act against what we know about his character, but are made only to contrive events and force them to move in an unnatural way. Gilgamesh is yet another plot device. On a slightly unrelated topic, instead of sticking around long enough to use Rin as the vessel, he leaves to spectate the battle between Archer and Shiro, which, if we're going to ignore everything about his deal, this isn't necessarily a problem. It means he can confirm when the fight ends, keep an eye on Saber in case she leaves to rescue Rin, and he can also trust Kirei to have Lancers secure the vessel while everyone else is distracted. So, finding out that trust was misplaced and how badly Kirei completely fucked their original plan over makes this, admittedly, a little funny. But it's still really fucking stupid.
You had one, Joe.
Just the one.
After the fight ends, he cheap shots Archer, killing him instantly. Presumably. Then he decides to explain his evil plan, then leaves.
Excuse me, what?
As though it weren't unnatural enough that he decides to unnecessarily monologue to a group of people he plans to kill,
because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
Before he can start another fight, he decides to leave. And while it's not entirely made clear, it's hinted that this is because the building is falling apart. This by itself is already demonstrably contrived considering the feats we saw Gilgamesh achieve against Berserker and the carnage he survived at the end of the last war. There's no reason to leave these three alive, and less reason why he'd want to leave only because of the collapsing structure. What's more confusing is what he says after. This is also a contradiction to his motivation. He came here to make a deal with Archer so that he can get Rin and use her as the Grail's vessel. This makes it all the more questionable why those demands were acceptable to him. If Archer was the real target, why didn't he just kill him upon arrival? Especially when Archer was already threatening him in return and he had every motivation to retaliate. There's even less reason to support why he'd want to kill Archer either. That's not to say that there isn't a plausible motive for it, but none that he maintains consistently. This only supports the idea he should have every motivation to kill Archer immediately after he threatened him. Additionally, he should also want to kill Shiro for the same reason, but chooses to avoid conflict on multiple occasions. But most of all, he leaves Rin yet again. Not only has the writing used Gilgamesh primarily as a plot device, but it's written him without a consistent motivation. The last scene of the episode is the final confirmation of this. There's next to nothing that would have stopped him from simply kidnapping Rin himself and using her for the Grail. Instead, he leaves, coming across Shinji entirely by chance, and uses him as the vessel instead. Imagine if Shinji had died, or had simply never crossed paths until Ilia's heart expired. Their plan falls apart entirely. He had no reason to leave Rin again. The only reason he did was so he didn't have to fight our heroes. He didn't have to explain his plan to them. He did it because the audience wouldn't know otherwise. And while it's conceivable that he'd want to kill Archer eventually, if this was truly more important than securing the vessel, he shouldn't have allowed Archer off the hook so easily the first time, passing up both his real target and his second chance at getting the vessel he wanted. After getting a chance to heal, Rin and Shiro regroup at Ryoto Temple that night to try to destroy the Grail, but Gilgamesh stands in their way.
よもや三度もその不出来な顔を見るとはな。俺は早々に聖杯を作り、地獄の穴を開けてやろう。取り戻したければ早めにしろ。これは驚いた。
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
あんた、人類の大量虐殺なんて本気で考えてるわけ？
殺される程度の覚悟で俺に問いを投げるとはな。
This is yet another drastic shift in Gilgamesh's character for no explained reason. Why is he driven to anger when simply being questioned, but not when someone threatens him, who rejects and resists him, who tries to put their hands on him? Twice. He has tolerated every opposition from our heroes because it would be inconvenient to start a fight with them. That is, until now. This is shown all the more moments later. Rin tries to walk towards the Grail to shut it down, but Gilgamesh looses a shot and tries to kill her, only to be deflected by Shiro. This establishes two things: that he wants to prevent Rin from trying to reach the Grail, and that Shiro will block his attacks to protect her. This is not too dissimilar to the fight with Berserker, who was kept at a disadvantage throughout the fight because he acted as a shield for Ilia. Gilgamesh was happy to take advantage of this weakness in order to win the fight. Now, for unexplained reasons, he makes no attempt to use the same strategy a second time. While it's true that Shiro could block it a second time, the further Rin is away from the fight, the more difficult it will be to block another attack. We know that Gate of Babylon has a wide range and can be used at almost any angle at varying distances. It wouldn't take much to properly aim one or two after Rin had gotten far enough into the lake that Shiro couldn't block. Even if he could, it might also mean jumping into the water that were already established to be filled with curses. And that's being very generous, because Gilgamesh could simply overwhelm both of them with a barrage of simultaneous attacks that would make it impossible to block all at once. What's worse is that he actively chases down Shiro and moves further away from both the Grail and Rin, which will have even greater repercussions in the future. But worse than that, he actively chooses to go easy on Shiro, despite Rin being a more pressing issue for him at the moment. He stands to gain more by trying to kill Rin than he did by trying to kill Ilya, since it means that he could gain the advantage over Shiro and potentially stop Rin from ruining his plans. But because that means Shiro wouldn't be able to win the fight, the writing contrives his character yet again in order to progress the plot. If his character was written consistently, our heroes can't win. The fight continues until Rin succeeds at her goal. Without a core, the Grail reaches out to use Gilgamesh as a substitute. Instead, he draws Ea, his most powerful weapon, to subdue it. The second stage of the fight continues, as Shiro envelops them in his noble phantasm, a reality marble called Unlimited Bladeworks. In it, Shiro can use any number of swords as projectiles and fire them from virtually any angle, just like Gate of Babylon. Using this, he manages to block virtually all of his attacks with swords of equal strength, and manages to close the distance between them on more than one occasion in the fight. The biggest problem with this is the pure amount of versatility that Gate of Babylon possesses, which Gilgamesh refuses to use, even moments before his demise. At multiple points, he could use the chains from earlier to subdue him. Even as he becomes more aware of how outmatched his artillery is by itself, he never tries to draw Ea until it's too late, a weapon that, if Zero is any indicator, can destroy Unlimited Bladeworks altogether. Despite being arguably more frustrated than we've ever seen him in either series, he never sees fit to draw Ea and end it. The anime does have an answer to this.
今さら出し惜しむものがあるのかよ。本来貴様などエアを拝謁する権利すら持たん。
He's far too arrogant to draw it at any point other than the last moment, and to the show's credit, this much would appear consistent with what we've seen in Fate Zero, at least from what we can see on the surface. But in reality, this is another example of how inconsistent his character is, and there are many reasons why this explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Let's deconstruct this motivation to better understand it. Gilgamesh won't draw Ea for anyone he thinks doesn't deserve it. So what about characters like Shiro, people who are unworthy but are still more powerful than what the rest of his arsenal are capable of handling? It would make sense for him to want to throttle himself against someone like Ilya when he has the time to play around. But he doesn't have that kind of time now. The biggest advantage of the reality marble is that it prevents Gilgamesh from escaping mid-fight. If he doesn't kill Shiro quickly enough, regardless if he would have won eventually or not, Rin will escape with the core of the Grail, or worse, Saber will destroy it entirely while he's not looking. Why deem someone as unworthy of the full extent of his arsenal if what he intends to use isn't able to win? Surely he doesn't think that using an ineffective tactic will help him win. That would just be stupid of him. So, the next best faith interpretation is that those that are unworthy are also people he believes he can defeat only using Gate of Babylon's most base utilities. So the next question would be, how? True, it is a powerful weapon, but we see almost immediately how it's perfectly countered by Unlimited Bladeworks. Gilgamesh's projectiles are intercepted perfectly and precisely, some even before they're fired. Yet his only response is to continue firing in greater succession, but he has no reason to believe that would work any more effectively than it already has. Realistically speaking, Gilgamesh is severely outgunned with only Gate of Babylon. Shiro can telepathically control and fire any one of the thousands of swords all around them. Any one of the swords, even ones that Gilgamesh is standing right next to, could be used as a projectile, and it isn't nearly as telegraphed as his Gate of Babylon is, which displays bright golden glowing portals. He is outmatched based on the strategy that he chooses to use, and he should know this. Even if he wasn't, the amount of time that it takes for him to get anywhere close to winning would have been more than enough time for Rin to remove Shinji from the Grail and ruin his plan. He clearly does not want to lose to someone unworthy, even though he can't win without the tools that he won't use against someone unworthy. Even if he wins, he still loses. So I can only call this stupidity, but that's not what some will tell you. Just the same catch-all meaningless excuse that he's arrogant.
豪眼にも2種類あってな、器が小さすぎる場合と望みが大きすぎる場合、前者は珍しくもない愚昧に過ぎんが、愚昧に過ぎんが、愚昧に過ぎんが。
Let's actually address this since it's a much broader problem in the field of writing critique. Using arrogance as an excuse for a villain's decision is not something unheard of in writing, but there are many that treat this character attribute as an end-all justification for any otherwise questionable decision a character might make. Arrogance is certainly a personality flaw that any character can have, It can even be the quintessential trait that causes that character's downfall. But I think it should go without saying that arrogance as a character trait doesn't excuse every poor decision that character makes by merit that it's a plausible flaw. There are many examples of characters, villains most of all, who suffer losses due to their own obvious mistakes. Some notable examples include Walter White, Oberyn Martell, Light Yagami, General Hux, and Jafar. For whatever reason, they choose to limit their abilities or purposefully handicap themselves in some way that inevitably leads to their own failure. Despite such decisions appearing unnecessary or obviously incorrect, they continue with this decision out of some inner character flaw that they possess. Light chooses to kill Lindale Taylor when it doesn't benefit him in any way, which results in Elle learning what city Kira lives in. Jafar chooses not to kill Aladdin with sorcery and instead toys with him long enough until he's defeated. Oberyn Martell doesn't kill Gregor Clegane, instead hoping to get a confession out of him first, which allows the Mountain enough time to kill him. Walter White turns down Elliot and Gretchen's offer to pay for his cancer treatment free of charge, which leads to, well, the rest of Breaking Bad. And General Hux refuses to shoot at the Raddus while they're escaping in the beginning of The Last Jedi, and sends no Star Destroyers ahead when chasing them in the second act, both of which result in the Resistance escaping. I want you to think about that last example most of all, and ask yourself, why would he do this? If you think that Hux's decision was not only in character, but that the reason he made it was out of arrogance, you would be incorrect. As for the other 4 examples, if you thought that those decisions were made out of arrogance, I'm sorry, but you're also wrong about that too. There are no characters that make decisions out of arrogance. Ever. Not even characters who are arrogant. This is a misconception that many people have about character flaws that needs to be corrected. To say that a character makes a decision because they are arrogant implies that they are cognizant of their arrogance. They knowingly choose to make arrogant decisions because it is a trait that they value. This is not impossible for a character to be written as, but none of the characters who are defended as being arrogant, especially not the 5 I mentioned, fit this description at all. This also comes from a misunderstanding of what makes an arrogant character good or bad. A good example is one who is characterized as arrogant by their questionable but prototypical decisions irrelevant of their arrogance, while poorly written characters are the reverse, written to take action off of the arbitrary basis that they're supposed to be arrogant and nothing more. But those decisions of those well-written characters are rooted in something far more fundamental to their character and background, and then making those decisions is what makes them an arrogant character. Light grew up being the smartest, most talented student by far. He was used to being superior to all those around him, so when he's challenged on public television in front of what he believes was all of Japan, he'd feel humiliated if he could not prove himself able to rise to it. Walter White grew up in a similar situation, feeling superior to so many around him due to his intellect, and because of this it made him insecure about his financial success in comparison to Gretchen's. And thus he cut all ties with her and Grey Matter in order to prove he is capable of finding the same success on his own. Oberyn Martell wanted not only to defeat the man who raped and murdered his sister, but also to humiliate him. He wanted to prove the Mountain's guilt in front of the very rulers of King's Landing themselves. Jafar is possibly the most unalike of the 4. It was arrogant of him not to kill Aladdin, but he was also capable of toying with him for however long he wanted without any hope of losing. He had lived inferior to a sultan that he considered a fat oaf, and waited years looking to amass enough power to one day surpass him. He is so fixated on gaining power that he doesn't consider how each of his wishes invalidates the last, or any other repercussions that they might have. After waiting years and years for this very moment, he only wanted to prove that he was the most powerful. You'll notice a common through line between all of these characters is that they felt the need to prove themselves in some way, either due to insecurity, inferiority, or some other personal reason. While all of these decisions could be called arrogant, none of them were made because they were arrogant. That's because good, arrogant characters don't make decisions on the basis of being arrogant. Arrogance, even in real life, arises from a need to prove something. To show that someone can accomplish what they want, how they want to, even when they don't need to, or shouldn't have to. This is the problem with defending Hux. There is nothing he wants to prove that can be proven by allowing the Resistance so many opportunities to escape. Anything that he would need to prove could be accomplished by simply being a competent general. Shooting at the Raddus instead of the Resistance base that they're fleeing accomplishes this, as does sending Star Destroyers ahead to keep the enemy within firing range instead of waiting for their fuel to run out. Since failure will only result in his further humiliation, he'd want to remove as many sources of failure as possible. But there's another reason this isn't in character. No matter how arrogant that character is, their pride alone should not supersede their intelligence, base sensibilities, and instincts for self-preservation. Huck should know in both the first and second act of the film that the Resistance has the opportunity to escape if the Raddus isn't destroyed. The first because, well, that much is obvious, as they're capable of jumping to hyperspace at any time that they're ready. And this is true for the second act, because he should be able to reference any star charts to determine that they're nearing a planet to where the Resistance can escape to, and then ram the Supremacy after evacuating. Every piece of information should inform him of the numerous opportunities he's giving the Resistance to escape that he might not be able to prevent if he doesn't take action. Instead, he ignores any amount of his own sensibilities. As for the other good examples I gave, Light had no way of knowing that killing Lindell Taylor would reveal his location to the police, or that anyone could even have concluded Kira was anyone but a god. If he had pulled something like this well into Kira's investigation, it would be incredibly out of character. Oberyn Martell was confident that he could beat the Mountain in a duel, and if he hadn't dragged things out just to get a confession, he would have easily. He is far superior to the Mountain in every possible way, and he only lost because the Mountain took advantage of one single moment of weakness. But if the duel was far more equal, with more close calls on Martell's part, then choosing to needlessly extend the battle instead of cutting his losses would make him appear stupid, not arrogant. Jafar knows that no one can beat him with his power, at least not in a straight fight. There was never any reason to assume that allowing any of the heroes to live would come back to bite him, which is also reinforced by the movie with how he only lost because he was outsmarted. And while it's true that by declining Gretchen and Elliot's help means that Walter would likely die of lung cancer, his arrogance doesn't prevent him from understanding and accepting this fact, which he does, under the conditions that he can earn the money to help pay for his son's education through the manufacture and distribution of methamphetamines. Even though all of these characters made arrogant decisions, none of them are made without consideration to their sensibilities and desire for self-preservation. This is exactly what's wrong with Gilgamesh's choice not to use Aya in the fight with Shiro. He has no reason to believe that Gate of Babylon is sufficient enough to overcome unlimited blade works. And the longer the fight continues, the more apparent that should be. And it doesn't help that the proof of how evenly matched the two noble phantasms are is made clear as soon as Shiro uses it. In fact, he should have realized that Shiro was more equal to him than he thought, just by nature that he managed to close the gap between them. Gilgamesh is displayed to be primarily and almost exclusively a ranged combatant, both in Bladeworks and Zero. Because sword fighting is beneath him, it's a triviality that he only resorts to by means of a dramatic finisher, so the fact that Shiro is able to force him to even pick up a sword at all should be a major indicator of how unfit Gate of Babylon is to win the fight. He ignores his sensibilities and his intelligence is undermined when there is no reason it should. But this is just examining his sensibility when making these decisions, regardless if it's plausible to begin with. Like I've said, arrogant decisions are made out of a desire to prove something to others in a way that is consistent with that character. What exactly is he proving by using an ineffective tactic that wouldn't even remotely allow him to win in time to stop the Grail from being destroyed? We're given no context about his standard of worth beyond its superficial excuse to facilitate his numerous losses. We're not even told what it is he thinks he's proving by upholding this standard. If he wants to prove his superiority, he doesn't need to delineate between worth of his opponents to do this. For all intents and purposes, he is superior just with Aya alone. Of course, even if not for that, he still had chains and even a teleportation ability that he never uses once. You know what, let's talk about that, because that's something that's been pissing me off since episode 14. Bet a bunch of people probably thought that this was real clever that Gilgamesh could use Gate of Babylon as a portal. Before episode 14, we've been led to believe that only his treasures could enter and exit the gate. Showing that it can be used on other objects and other people really just throws more holes into the fight with Shiro. I want you to imagine if, instead of using Aya, at the last minute, Gilgamesh put up a portal, displacing Shiro long enough for Gilgamesh to end the fight. I want you to imagine if he put these portals in front of him at all times, redirecting all of Shiro's attacks and creating a literal indestructible shield that nothing could get through. Imagine teleporting himself directly behind Shiro and just stabbing him through the chest, or displacing him miles in the air and just waiting for him to fall to his death. Hell, what if he displaces Shiro halfway through the portal and then closes it? Portals as a superpower are kind of fucking broken, and when you throw a broken ability onto an already broken character, it makes that much less sense how he loses. He has no reason not to use any of these tools in the fight that wouldn't undermine his intelligence. But even then, the problem with his decision is much more fundamental than a break in his character. In a vacuum, and if executed more properly, this wouldn't even be an issue. After all, if he were more content to simply lose to someone who he thought was unworthy but still maintain his standard anyways, I wouldn't really see a problem with this. But the true issue isn't that his character shouldn't be arrogant, nor that his character is only in conflict with his arrogance, but rather that he has no character at all, arrogant or not. From the moment he told his motivations to Shinji, Gilgamesh has remained a hodgepodge of conflicting motivations that constantly swapped back and forth whenever was convenient for the given moment. At some points he decided to be active in the war, and at others he chose to be apathetic. Some goals of his would be established one minute, but then swapped out for another when it meant fighting with our heroes any sooner than the anime thought it should have. There were times when arrogance was present and shouldn't be, and others where it should have been but wasn't. And this is most of all why arrogance as an excuse for his poor decisions isn't narratively justifiable. He's perfectly fine submitting to the worst master in the war and shrugs off many commands given by said master without a thought, but is easily angered when Rin questions him a single time. He's fine touting his superiority over someone like Shiro, but will give in to the demands by someone equally as fake and isn't offended by Archer's blatant threats. He's even reserved enough to allow Shinji to place a hand on his shoulder on multiple occasions. There are just as many points when his arrogance is absent as there are when it's present, if not more. His arrogance being the excuse for his loss is just one part of a much bigger problem. If it's more convenient for the moment, the anime will write him with or without said arrogance, rather than maintain a natural or consistent character. Lancer at least had some moments that were in character, despite also being a plot device. But Gilgamesh is used almost exclusively as a plot device, throwing away any sort of consistency his character could have had. And then there's the apathy. Now, in fairness, Fate Zero's Gilgamesh was also apathetic, but he was written with a motivation to be apathetic. He wasn't after the Grail or anything it can do for him, he just wanted to be entertained. But he wasn't incapable of putting that aside when he decided the war was worth his attention. In Bladeworks, we are also told that Gilgamesh is apathetic, but has a motivation that suggests the opposite. The assumption is that this is in character, and while I don't think it is entirely out of character, think about this for a minute. He doesn't kill our hero the first chance he has, but so long as he can always kill them later whenever he wants, it's fine. So then he allows Rin to escape so that he can't use her as the vessel like he wanted, but so long as he has Shinji to use as a backup, it's fine. So then he loses track of Shinji and doesn't know if he's alive, and also lets Rin go again, leaving him without a vessel. But so long as Shinji is actually alive and no one disrupts the transformation, it's fine. So then he doesn't stop Rin from disrupting the Grail, because he decides to go off and fight Shiro far away, but so long as he can defeat him real quick and then stop Rin before she disrupts the Grail, it's fine. So then that happens, and now the Grail needs a new vessel, but so long as he can still get over there quick enough before Saber destroys it, it's fine. So then Shiro traps him in Unlimited Blade Works, he has no idea what's going on, if the Grail is still in one piece or not, and he knows it's going to be destroyed soon. But so long as he uses his resources to escape and actually tries to stop them before foiling his plans, it's fine. Well, he doesn't do that and then he dies. He's not an antagonist, not in the same way that he is in Zero. He doesn't actually antagonize our main characters. In fact, he makes every decision that allows them to defeat him, letting them live again and again, not taking advantage of Shiro's care for Rin the same way he did for Berserker and Ilya, needlessly lengthening out the fight with Shiro, and ignoring the fact that his plans are about to be foiled. This is not arrogance, this is stupidity. Even as his plans are about to be stopped at that moment, he just doesn't care. He doesn't care that the one thing he was waiting 10 years to use to genocide the world he hates so much is going to be gone in a moment. On the other hand, Archer in Zero was an effective villain because even before he decided to win the Grail, he would still act if taunted in any way. He was established to be a clear threat that was not meant to be trifled with, and would not let people simply walk all over him, even over something so minuscule. And his very presence regardless created tension because defeating him was necessary for our main characters to achieve their goals. So even when he wasn't actively chasing Team Saber, the anticipation of that confrontation was still rising, a stark juxtaposition with how Gilgamesh in Bladeworks was just barely built up as a last-minute villain for an impromptu climactic battle. There's nothing about his absence of antagonism that builds up to the final confrontation like it does with Archer and Kirei in Zero. Shiro doesn't want the Grail, and just wants to stop others from obtaining it. So when Gilgamesh doesn't make an effort to obtain it, or stop our heroes, there's not much tension to be had besides the arbitrary assumption that they're going to fight because that's just what they're supposed to do. excusing many of his actions because of his arrogance is actually quite ironic because he acts far more humbly and with more humility than people are willing to acknowledge, certainly more than his counterpart in Zero does. He yields himself to the weakest master in the war. He allows others to berate, order, and threaten him. He takes no offense to those who oppose him before the last moment, and is unconcerned with the many questionable decisions that could have cost him his goals until then. Am I really supposed to believe he's too busy finding something else to be entertained by than to act in any consistent way in the war? What exactly is he being entertained by? What does he find entertaining about serving Shinji, or submitting to Archer's demands, or Rin's? Gilgamesh may have found the Fourth Grail War boring, but he was still actively engaging with other characters, servants, and participants. He was still a character with motives that he acted on in a way that supported the narrative and supported him as a character. We have no idea what Gilgamesh was doing during the weeks that he was just sitting on his ass doing nothing narratively significant, and we're expected to believe that fits with his character just because it must in order for Bladeworks to go the way it does. To anyone who still disagrees, let's suppose it makes sense in any way for him not to do anything, and make every action that just happens to allow our heroes to keep winning until the finale. Virtually every villain has had this same problem or something akin to it. Ilya and Berserker refuse to do anything for 10 days, and then they die. Lancer is completely irrelevant. So too is his master, besides supposedly being menacing for a whole week. Shinji is completely incapable of antagonizing. Castor is really the only outlier. As I said back in part 2, she is the main antagonist because she and Kusuke are the only ones who manage to antagonize for the majority of the anime. And even then, that's only because of A, how inconsistent their power levels are, and B, how many chances Rin has passed up to stop them, and wastes days at a time doing literally anything else while people are dying every hour. Thanks for that, by the way. And now there's Gilgamesh, who doesn't act on his motivations unless it's convenient, who doesn't oppose our heroes unless it's convenient, and when he finally decides to antagonize, he dies out of sheer stupidity. With all that in mind, what is the threat for most of the plot? What should I be worried about when all of the villains are either too lazy, too stupid, or too inconsistent to gauge any real tension from the conflicts they create? Whether or not there's a reason for any of it, what should I feel invested in when these conflicts are so dull? Granted, there's still one antagonist that we haven't gone over yet, but we'll get to that. We're almost done anyway. Having covered pretty much the entire side cast for both shows, I think at this point it's clear enough which anime has my favor. But there is still one left. So far, we've covered every servant. We've analyzed Archer, Saber, Rider, Lancer, Berserker, Caster, and Assassin. We've compared both incarnations of Kirei Kotomine, and cross-compared Rin Tosaka with her father Tokiomi. We've examined each of the masters and the relationship they shared with their respective servants. With one exception. There is only one character left to examine. It's time to talk about Emiya.